Rebecca and I got together a couple of times to talk about what we would do, and we ended up telling stories, just swapping stories.
Edward and Carol are very dear to me, so this is hard doing it without them tonight. But they're here in spirit, and we know it. Leon and I have very different storytelling styles. Leon, as you know, is your Boones Creek bard. He can tell anything in rhyme. I don't do much in rhyme. I've tried it a couple of times. You know, the hard thing about rhyme is that you start out, and if you get off, you can't get back on. And one time I was doing it with my daughter at a Methodist church in Piney Flats, Tennessee, and I was trying out a new story, and it was about Jonah in the Bible. That's another thing, is I do almost all biblical stuff, so this is all very different for me tonight to tell you, but I am going to tell you some stories, some family stories tonight. And so at the end of the program, I am going to do a biblical story for you. And Leon does all this wonderful hard stuff to me. It just seems so hard to be able to do it in rhyme. But one night I was over at the Methodist church in Piney Flats, Tennessee, and Madison was about freshman in high school. She was sitting on the front row. And I started out with, well, the Lord told Jonah that he had a job to do. Go to Nineveh, he said. They are wicked and untrue. Tell them that their evil and their wicked ways are wrong. Tell them God is mad and my patience won't last long. Well, I started out telling that, and I got to about the second stanza, and I got off. And Madison sat on the front row, and she did this. Well, we get in the car that night, and she said, Mom, I could have done better than you. And I don't think I've ever done anything in rhyme since. But Cuz here. Now, we've been asked, how are you all cousins? Well, Leon's mama was a Kefauver, and I asked my daddy while we were on, before you came up here. And Daddy said that your great-grandfather and my great-grandfather are brothers.
Yes. Mm-hmm. We're also kin to Estes Kefauver.
Yes. And, but we've always considered each other cousins.
Yeah, we've always considered each other cousins.
We have people that tell us we look alike.
We grew up in this church. That's another thing that we had in common. So we heard some of the same stories. Of course, I was quite a bit before her.
A decade.
But we experienced a lot of the same things. Like I showed Angus cattle, but she came along 10 years later showing Holsteins. Yeah, but I remember this church. I remember back in that back corner was. That was the Mary Kefauver class. Mm-hmm. So when the women came in, they would sit in that back corner, and the men sat up here when they came into church, because that would be the Russell Crouch taught the men's Sunday school class. Mm-hmm. And my brother
and Jenny Butler.
Yeah.
Jenny Butler sat about right here where this girl is. And my sisters and I would take bets on whether she or Miss Hodges' hair was going to be bluer.
And Granny would always open up her pocketbook when we started fidgeting and pull out a half a piece of juicy fruit gum and give to us. And then we'd spend the rest of the sermon picking the pocketbook lint out of her teeth.
You got pocketbook lint? I got a pinch. My mama would pinch us when we misbehaved. Yeah. And I did that one night, and my dad carried me out screaming and kicking, and I peed all down the front of him. Yeah. And they had to call the service off that night.
But, Bo Dyer was an elder and a deacon here for a long time, and when his kids were small, Pat Dyer, and she's not here so I can talk about her. She was a handful. I mean, she was really a handful. And I remember one time that she was misbehaving, which was usual, but it's something that Bogue figured it was time for him to take her out. And he took her by the hand, and you could see him walking down the center aisle. And the closer they got to the back door, you could tell that Pat knew what was coming. So when she got to the back door, she slipped out of his hand and started running around the church. You could hear her running and screaming as they went around the church. Bo right behind her. You come back here, and she's saying, "You're not going to get me." And you know, all the people in the congregation.
All the windows were up. We had no air conditioning.
And it did. Then when Bo stubbed his toe on the tombstone, things did get interesting then.
Yeah. That was before I was born.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But you remember Mr. Barker.
I do remember Mr. Barker. I don't know if I should say this or not, but Mr. Barker had a big hole in his nose, and that fascinated me. And I
It did me when 10 years
and I stared at it all the time, and I was always afraid one of the flies would go in there.
Yeah. But then there was this, when Charles Reese was up here preaching to the full house one day.
Oh, my. I'll never forget that. I was in the choir, and the choir was lined up on, we had choir pews going this way for a while. And I could see Russell. He was going around, and I knew what he was going to do. You see, we went through a period of time where some of the grandfathers baptized their grandchildren in this church, and it was a really sweet and precious time. And there was somebody had locked the door, and he couldn't get from one side to the other side. Now, behind this big screen is a baptistry where he was trying to get to turn the water on for a baptism. And so the only thing he knew to do was to cross over that back ledge of that baptistry, which was about this wide.
Now, there's normally a curtain that's pulled in front of the baptistry, but this particular day there was not a curtain in front of the baptistry. I see Martha going.
And when you're walking on a ledge that's just about that wide, and you're 60-some years old, you don't look behind you. And he was doing this. Everybody in the congregation was laughing. Charles Reese didn't know what he had said in his sermon that was funny. The choir could see him as he did his Spider-Man thing. But we have a lot of great memories in this church, and a lot of people that we love dearly and learn tremendous things for. So we're glad to be with you all tonight and tell you some of our stories.
I see a lot of people here from Boones Creek, but then here's a group of people that came, and most of them are from Philadelphia. Just welcome our Philadelphia friends here tonight. I don't know if you know Arnold Hopland, who has doctor's care in Johnson City, but his brother's over here, and they have relatives in. And we're so glad you could be with us. All you visitors, we're glad, and all you home folk, too. We tell stories. Well, this is the Boones Creek Historic Trust, and they've got a real fantastic museum downstairs, and they collect all kinds of things, and they're working on building a building. And your donations tonight will help support the new building.
And they have a new book for sale, too,
Yeah.
called The Early Settlers of Washington County. So don't miss out on thinking about getting that as well.
Let me start out with a little story here about my granny.
Okay.
Her family. Yeah. I am a Kefauver, and I think that's some of the dominant genes from the Kefauver family. If anybody saw on Facebook the picture of my mother, you'll know how much I look like my mother, and then the blonde hair and everything that goes with it. It's gray now, but it used to be blonde. Mm-hmm. But my grandmother was a Cox, and she lived over at Boogaboo Springs. So, just go up the road here about 4 miles, and that's where my granny grew up. William Henry Cox was her dad. And he married Dora Hill. Dora Hill. And they had a whole bunch of kids, and my granny was one of them. There was one of them was Nell, who married Walt Bacon, and Walt Bacon was the proprietor of Loafer's Glory, which is right next to the house where Rebecca grew up.
Spent many a quarters there.
Many quarters, yeah.
Mm-hmm, got quarters.
At Loafer's Glory, the old country store. And later on tonight, I'll tell you another story about an old country store. But my great-grandfather, William Henry Cox, married Dora Hill, and they had about 3 boys and 3 girls, and then Dora Hill died, and he married Molly Carey. And they had 2 more children. It was Catherine and Jesse. But my grandmother would tell me stories about the evil stepmother. You know, these fairy tales, and it'd be the evil stepmother. But she'd always say, "I didn't have an evil stepmother. I had a wonderful stepmother." And so she was raised by her stepmother. But her stepmother had a brother, and his name was Will Carey. And Will Carey married a lady named Mary Hamilton. But the house that my mama lives in, if you go down here 2 miles to the red light and turn right up Highland Church Road, the first house on the right, that's the house that I grew up in. It's the house my mother grew up in. She lives there today. She was 94 years old Saturday. It was her birthday, Saturday. But she, Will Carey built that house, and that was my grandmother's stepmom's brother. So they weren't really blood kin, but Will and Mary Carey loved my grandmother. She was my grandmother would go spend the night with her. That house was built in 1899 that they built. But my grandmother would go spend the night with Will and Mary Carey. And then later on, my mom lived up the road. My mom was born in 1920, so in 1930, when my mom was real little, she was like a grandchild of Will and Mary Carey, who never had any children. Back in those days, let's look back to 1920, 1930, there weren't as many assisted living facilities around, so family had to take care of each other. Well, they didn't have any children, so my mom would go and throw the hay down out of the barn so Uncle Will could, I call him Uncle Will, but so he could milk the cows. And so they finally propositioned my mom, and Granny and Granddad said, if you'll move into this house and take care of us, we will give you that farm, And that's why my mom is living in that farm there today, the place where I grew up. But when my great-grandfather, when his first wife died, she was buried up at the Deacon's Cemetery. And then he died, and he was buried there beside her in the Deacon's Cemetery. And then when Molly Carey Cox died, she was buried beside him. So you can go up in the Deacon's Cemetery right now, which is off Hugh Eisenhower Road, which is off the old Boones Creek Road. But it's a beautiful old cemetery, and there's my great-grandfather with these 2 wives beside him. But that's really not that unusual to have multiple spouses buried together. Because my twin brother and I, we were grave diggers. Now, we looked at, opportunities to make money, and one of the best ways we could make money was digging graves. And we dug a grave one day on this cemetery, and there was a lady being buried, and she had her first husband. They had 8 children together, and he died. She buried him there in that cemetery. And then she married another husband, and they had 6 children together, and she buried him. And then so my brother and I dug the grave between these 2 men. So there's the lady buried with the 2 husbands beside. And I never will forget that. My brother and I came late. Well, we thought it was going to be late. We were going to come to where we could cover the grave after the graveside service. And we walked up we were standing under a shade tree. And with 14 kids, there was a whole passel of people there at the funeral. I mean, there was 100 or more. And they were milling around waiting for the graveside service to start. My brother and I just sitting back watching. And the preacher wanted to get everybody together. And there was these 2 women standing way back at the old women, and you could be at the same age as the woman that had been buried. And they were kind of talking in the back, and the preacher wanted to get them together. He said, "They're finally together." And everybody started paying attention and started walking up, and he said, "They're finally together." And these old ladies were standing back there talking, and heard one of them, they were hard of hearing, and one of them said, "What did he say?" The other one said, "Preacher said they're finally together." And the first one said, "Must be talking about her legs." But my brother and I used this grave digging thing for years to help make money. When we were in our teens, one thing was for sure when someone passed away. When our relatives consoled the bereaved, we knew what they were going to say. We're sad to hear of your loss. We brought food over because we know you're weak. And the Overbay boys are the best two grave diggers ever known to Boones Creek. Well, there was a time when a local drunk got run over by a train. No one volunteered to dig the grave. No one would admit they knew his name. Then someone volunteered, the Overbay boys said, they're the best around. So we went out that night determined to plant that drunk in the ground. Well, the first 3 feet went well, then we hit a huge rock. We couldn't break it with sledgehammers, so our digging had to stop. Then 3 of the local drunks' buddies came out to view the site. They said, that's a big rock, boys. We'll get you some dynamite. Well, these good old boys left us some home brew to console us during our wait. How could we be so lucky? Their assistance was purely faith. They brought back 6 sticks of dynamite to help us complete our task. The hole was a perfect size after the 4th blast. We shaped up the sides and the bottom, then somehow found our way home. Our parents thought our stuttering and stammering was caused by the work we had done. We agreed that in the future we should much better behave. Then we realized we'd left 2 sticks of dynamite in the bottom of that grave. The dust must have covered the sticks because they were completely out of sight. This should not cause a problem. It'd take a flame to cause them to ignite. Surely this would not cause a disruption in tomorrow's ceremony where sisters and brothers in faith gather to share in their testimony. Well, the preacher decided to use this drunk as a poor example of Christian life. He said, I don't know who he was, but he sure caused a lot of strife. There's no way that God would take him to heaven. He has to go down below because of his sinning. Where he is going, none of you want to go. Well, as the service was ending, one of the drunk's buddies rolled a cigarette and struck a match. He flipped it into the grave, and it caused a flash that ignited the 2 sticks of dynamite as the coffin was lowering to the ground. The earth began to rumble. The blast caused a deafening sound. Everyone at the service, which was surprisingly well attended, was stunned by the noise, then watched in awe as the body toward heaven ascended. My brother and I knew what happened. We didn't talk. We knew our rights. Preacher, well, he left the ministry, started bagging groceries at White's. But we were never volunteered for grave digging again. Our relatives didn't want us involved no matter how much the deceased had sinned. We never again had to use grave digging for financial gain. And we'd owe it all to the drunk that ascended after being run over by a train.
How do you follow that?
You'll do a good job on that.
I should have gone first. I think I'm going to tell you a story about the fair, because it's that time of year when we go to the fair, and it was written for Martha and Sandra Gray, and they're here. God love them, they got to hear it again. But anyway, most of you haven't heard it, so I hope you enjoy it. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. That's what Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz. But I knew that long before I ever saw that movie. You see, growing up on a dairy farm, my father had 4 girls, and he put us in the 4-H. He had been a grandson to one of the Kefauver brothers, Angus Farm, and he had known about showing all his life, showing Angus like Leon did. But he wanted us to show Holsteins because that's what he had gotten into. He and my grandfather had bought a farm a few miles from the Kefauver Angus brother farm, and it was a dairy farm. It had grade dairy cattle. And when my father took it over and began running the farm on his own, he went to one of his good lifelong friends, the county agent, Charlie Griffith, and they went and bought a registered Holstein. Her name was Royal, and it was my oldest sister, Teresa, who's here with me tonight. It was her first animal, show animal. She was 10 years old, which was the age you could show. Well, we showed cattle starting in Gray, and then we would go to Greenville, then Newport, then Knoxville, then Nashville, then Memphis with our show cattle. And we showed the majority of cattle in gray because gray was really one of the best shows there was. People came from all over the Southeast to show their cattle here. And so we loved being at the Gray Fair because it was home, you know. And there were so many things that it required us to do. First of all, you just don't take cattle to the fair and not train them. So our job started in the summer. My father would stand about a month before out in the field with a piece of straw in his mouth and try to look over the cattle and decide which ones he was going to take. Because you see, that first cow he bought ended up being grand champion, and he had the bug bad. And he read everything he could on pedigrees and learned how to buy the best possible cattle, the cattle that would do well showing. And so in the field, he would look over his cattle and decide which one was the best, and he would bring them into the barn. We would rope halter them. We would wash them. We would curry comb all their winter coat off of them. And then our summer jobs really began. Because when you tie up cattle in a barn and you put them on fresh straw, as soon as they soil it, that straw has to be picked up and moved and fresh straw laid down. They had to be washed. They had to be led. They had to be fed. They had to be led to the milk house if they were milking cows. So we spent a lot of time at the barn. My dad mowed off a patch of land, and we would go out and we would practice at least twice a day leading those cows. My dad taught us how to put our hand right next to the cow's jaw where you could grip that halter. And he would say, "Don't let them get away, girls. If you let them get away once, they're going to do it again." And he would say, "Hang on for dear life, girls." And he also told us one other thing. Never wrap your rope around your hand, because if one of them takes off, you'll lose your hand. Well, the first week of training the cattle was always the toughest. One night, about sunset, we were walking the cattle around and around and around, and Dad was out there with us always. He never left us. And a cat out of the barn decided to mosey up to Cindy's heifer. Cindy was one of my sisters, for those of you who don't know. And Cindy took the rope halter, which had a big knot at the end of it, and tried to shoo that cat away. And she hit that cat upside the head, and that cat fell over. We all started crying, "Cindy, you have killed the cat! You've killed our cat!" Cindy became hysterical. She tried to hand the halter off to Dad. Dad said, "Wait just a minute." That cat got up, walked a few more steps, fell over again. Got back up, walked a few more steps, fell over again. Finally, it did that several times. Finally made its way to the barn. And that night when we went in and sat around the dinner table and Dad gave thanks for the food, and he said, "God, thank you that a cat has 9 lives." And there was a resounding amen around the table. But not too long after that, I got my first calf. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was UT Dairy Day in Knoxville, Tennessee. Big cattle show and an auction. All 4-H'ers came from around the state to UT. I was 9 years old and was sitting beside my mom in the stands. I could see my daddy talking to some farmers down around the ring where they were auctioning off the cattle. I watched as my daddy silently nodded to the auctioneer again and again. And I watched as the auctioneer hit his gavel on the stand, and he said, "Sold to the man in the plaid shirt." And my mama leaned over and whispered to me, and she said, "I think your daddy just bought you a calf." I ran down off of those steps and ran over to Daddy and tugged on his pant leg, and I said, "Is she mine, Daddy? Is she mine?" He says, "She's yours and your responsibility." We went into the barn where we tied her up, and I laid down in the straw beside her. I was in love with my calf. Her name was Massiveville Golden Topper Pet. So we called her Pet. Well, I had to wait a year because I wasn't quite old enough to show. I had to be 10. So when I became 10, I was so excited when Daddy says, "Girls, it's time to get the show cattle out." I just couldn't wait to see my baby calf and walk her around that showroom. I had no idea how much a calf grew in a year's time. But she was much bigger than me now, much stronger, much feistier. Well, our first day of leading around went pretty good until the Ramsey boys drove their fast car down the road. They always had souped up cars. They lived down the road from us and always had big fast cars with no mufflers on them, and they sounded really loud, and they drove really fast. Scared us to death when they would go by, but they tooted at us when they saw us, and my skittish young heifer took off running. Daddy was saying this time, "Let her go, let her go, let her go." Because I had forgotten his one rule: never wrap your rope around your hand. And when Pet finally got stopped, there wasn't much skin left on this hand. It was a painful lesson, but one paid off in the long run. Pet ended up winning us many, many grand champions, and was a great cow. But fair was a lot of work. It was a lot of work once we got there. It wasn't that the work just happened at home, but when we took the cattle and we tied them up for display, they had to be pristine. So that meant every time they went to the bathroom, we had the pitchfork, and we were moving it, putting down fresh straw. Every time it seemed to get hot in the barns, we were walking them out and getting them water. We were brushing them. We were combing them. We worked hard. My grandmother would give us breaks. My grandmother Kiefhofer, Lenny Kiefhofer, she would come by and give us breaks. She always carried her aluminum folding chair. What do you call it? Like a outdoor chair. I can't even think. But anyway, she would bring her chair with her and sit down, and we would play rook in between the cleanings. She gave us so much fun, but I'm telling you what, she was a serious rook player. And people gathered around the barn to watch her play. But we had a wonderful time, and on show day, it became very serious. We got up at 5:30 in the morning. That's when we were at the fair by. All the cattle had to be washed. They had to be dried. They had to be clean as they could be. The whites had to be as white as they could be, and the black had to be as silky and black shiny as it could be. And then my mom was in charge of our clothing. We wore white shirts, white pants, black and white saddle Oxford shoes, and ponytail ribbons. Now that might not seem like that's a hard outfit for a mama to put together, but when you do 4 of them and they're pressed with creases down the pants and everything is perfect, and they've been around cattle, cow manure, and red candy apples, it was hard to keep that clean. She had a job. But anyway, we would show, and my daddy, no matter whether we finished first or last, he had a smile on his face when we left the barn. Somebody told me later that in my teenage years, he was overheard saying, "I'm known for my cattle, but I'm famous for my girls." When we had first shown, the first half of the day was the junior show. And when that was over, my mom would pull up in the station wagon. You know, one of those you probably remember, the Ford station wagon with the wood sides. And she would open up the back And there would be lunch fit for kings. Fried chicken, pimento cheese sandwiches, homemade slaw, and homemade desserts, and sweet tea or fresh squeezed lemonade. And once we had lunch, we would head back to the barn for the open show, getting our cattle ready. And after that show ended that night, my dad always somehow found money in his pocket to give us money to ride on the Midway. And my cousin Suzanne, who's sitting back there, she was one of those that showed cattle with us, and she got money too, and we went to the Midway. And one night, she and I rode the zipper 9 times. We had to stagger back to the barn. We were so motion sick from riding that far. But then, the most fun we ever had was at the Gray Fair, because that's where all of our friends and our family were. We had great farm families that we loved dearly. My daddy he's always had his birthday on the 24th of August, and that's always Fair Week. And my mother always made his favorite, which was a homemade German chocolate cake. And so everybody would come to the barn to eat a piece of Jean's cake and wish my daddy happy birthday. And out of those families, there were 2 particular families, the Bowmans and the Garlands, that we were really close to. 2 of my dearest friends was little Davy Garland, who's died now, and Benji Bowman. Oh my goodness. Between the practical jokes and the water fights and the laughter, little Davy Garland had a laugh like none other. It was so contagious. You could not be around that boy without laughing. And we sat one night eating what I called the food of the gods, which was a corn dog and French fries and a Coca-Cola. Nothing better on the fairgrounds than that. And we sat there, and little Davy came up with an idea. He said, I got an idea. He said, Benji, go get me a pair of your old work jeans. Benji got a pair of jeans, and we stuffed them with straw, and we put the straw legs down in a pair of cowboy boots. We put a shirt on it, put a belt on it, and cinched up the waist. We tied a string to it, and we slid that stuffed body under our largest Holstein cow. Weighed about 2,000 pounds, and she was down for the night, and we knew it. We tied that string to that body and across the aisle, and we set up a table where we played cards or pretending we were playing. And about that time, some of the city folks came in. You know, city folks are funny. We never knew it smelt bad in the barn, but they would hold their nose and, yeah, it stinks in here. Oh, man. And then they would point at things on the cows and say, do you think the milk comes from there? And sometimes what they pointed at was correct and sometimes not. And they would just freak out when a cow would raise its tail, and we just sat and laughed. But that night, when we had that body stuck under that big cow, and Benji would yank it right when they'd get close to it, and that leg would jerk, and that other leg would jerk, and people would scream and run out of the barn. It was all night. I mean, it was hysterical. We were laughing so hard. And we would try to straighten our face out before the next one would come through and scream, there's somebody under the cow. Aren't you all going to do anything about it? I mean, people were hysterical. And we had to finally stop when a woman got so hysterical that she ran out onto the Midway, got the EMS, and they came into the barn. And my daddy said, enough of the fun. Cut out the fun, guys. Because he knew we were going to get in really big trouble. But you know what? I never wanted to leave that barn at night. I said to my daddy, gosh, I wish I was a boy. Because every time I'd say, Daddy, can I stay the night in the barn with the guys? He'd say, of course not. Ladies don't sleep in a cattle barn. I wanted to stay so bad. We went to that fair my parents did, and took cattle, sometimes 18, sometimes 24, for 33 years. And now when fair time rolls around, I have that ache to go back to those cattle barns. Because you know why? Just like Dorothy said, there's no place like home.
It was 1961. Art Edwards was the preacher, and he was standing right here where the pulpit was. He preached a sermon about Jeremiah the prophet. He said that Jeremiah would stay outside the walls in Jerusalem. He prophesied to people that if you don't repent and change from your evil ways, that the Babylonians will come in and capture you and take you into captivity. He was a prophet, and he was right. I remember going home that after church, and my granddad was sitting on the front porch. My granddad was a prophet. He said, boys, if you keep swinging on them grapevines, one of them's going to break and you're going to get hurt. And it was that very afternoon when we went over to Joe Reed's house. Now, if you go back toward Jonesboro and you go up Kefauver Road, you go around the curve, the house on the left is where my Uncle Alf and Aunt Mame lived. And then the next house up was the Kefauver Brothers farm. And we'd go up there and hang around the barn. 14 years old, we first thing we'd do, we would get in the pickup truck and take off. You know, Joe drove, he was 13, but you didn't need a license back then if you drove the back roads, because the law never did patrol the back roads, and it was just no farm truck anyway. I remember we had a bunch of us, we went up on Uncle Alf's hill, and there was a patch of woods that was just kind of 45-degree angle for 100 yards up through there. We loved to squirrel hunt there because we could go up in the top and shoot the squirrels out of the tops of the trees, you know, that were down at the bottom. But when we drove up there, we saw this grapevine. It was a beautiful grapevine. It was still green. I mean, it would be perfect for swinging. And if you'd start on that grapevine, you could swing over a 6-strand barbed wire fence and way up over those trees down at the bottom. Well, the first thing we did was we got our Barlow knives out and we cut that grapevine in two. Then I remembered that my grandfather was a prophet, and he had prophesied to me, if you swing on those grapevines, you're going to get hurt. So I did what any normal boy would do under similar circumstances. We got one of the little kids to do it first. Rick Slagle was a year younger than us, and he could climb like a squirrel. Rick, do you want to go first? Sure, I'll go. So we put him on there and pushed him and swung him way out over the fence, way out over the woods, and he came back and made it safely. My turn. So I took the next turn. I jumped on, I grabbed a hole, swung out, just barely cleared the fence when the grapevine broke. And I remembered that my grandfather was a prophet, and he had told me, you know, that you're going to get hurt. I wasn't thinking about getting hurt. I was thinking about dying. I mean, it was 100 yards down, 45-degree bank to get to the bottom, and there was all kinds of trees there. My life flashed in front of me. You know how that happens? Don't you hate when that happens, when your life flashes in front of you? It's happened to a lot of you men, I know. Usually happens right after you say, hey, watch this.
Yeah.
I remember turning head over heels, and my head would come up, and I'd look, no tree. Turn again, no tree. I knew I was going to hit a tree, and then, so, you know, I started remembering. Well, the first part of it wasn't that bad. I started remembering some Christmases, a trip to the beach. I got the winning hit in a Little League baseball game. But then I remembered about a sermon that I'd heard at a revival when they said that you need to repent and confess of all your sins one by one. And I needed to do it quick because I was going to die any minute. I started praying.
And you had a bunch of sins.
Oh, yeah. I started praying as fast as I could. You know, please forgive me from putting the gum in Nancy's hair and the tack in Martha's chair. Sorry about that, Martha. There's my brother that did it, yeah. But, you know, I didn't know that Malin was in that outhouse. It's my brother's fault when we turned it over, you know. But I started trying to pray as quick as I could, and my life was going, and I wasn't but 14 years old. I really wasn't that mean, but from what the preacher said, I knew I was going to go to hell when I hit that tree. But I remember saying, Lord, if you'll please just protect me, I'll change my evil ways. And then I turned up and I could see, and I was getting close to the bottom, and there wasn't a tree in front of me. And I thought, hey, I think I'm going to live. And then I said, never mind, Lord, I'll take care of it myself. That's when I hit the stump. I wrapped around that stump like a wilted vine on a fence post. And I went unconscious. I woke up in the back of a pickup truck, and they were driving me out in the back of a pickup truck, and they were waiting till they got to the gate to see if I was alive to know whether to take me to the hospital or to the mortuary. But I remember then Rick saying, he's breathing, I think he's going to live. Good. We turned around, went back to the woods so we could play some more. That's the way we entertained ourselves back in 1961. Just a bunch of boys out in a pickup truck when we shouldn't have been, playing in the woods. A little different today. But I remember when I grew up and had sons of my own, I was thinking, should I be a prophet? Tell my kids that you better not play on grapevines or you'll get hurt. But you know, there's a lot of pride in standing there in the emergency room and somebody saying, like father, like son.
I talked a long time. Do you want to tell two in a row?
Well, I was thinking, I started out talking about Loafer's Glory. One of the institutions, you know, this is historical society, so we're going to teach you some history here. And one of the things that we did back in my day, and we teach history, Rebecca and I, through telling stories. My wife and I and Anita are members of the Jonesboro Yarn Exchange. We do this old-time radio show where it's a community building event by just telling stories once a month, and it's broadcast on NPR the fourth Wednesday of each month at 8 o'clock, 89.5 FM, WETS. But we tell these stories about how we learned when we were kids. People need to know the roots sometimes to know how they got to where they are. But the Old Country Store was definitely an establishment that affected all of us, that a lot of us here in this room, especially the boys, we'd hang out at the store, wouldn't we, Butch? Now, Beard's store was the one that was more convenient to me, so we'd hang out at H.M. Beard's Grocery. Beard Hope finally got killed in a gunfight, and everybody knew he was going to get killed in a gunfight if anybody ever pulled a gun on him. But it was a great place of learning down there. And I remember we'd sit there at the store this one particular time. It was probably back in about 1959. And Ernest Carter owned the land down there. And the Gillens were farming it with a pair of mules. And they had these mules that were just great workers. Now, we had horses that we worked. We had the prettiest team of horses you've ever seen. We had this Palomino looking. It was a Cherry Roan and a Pinto, and they were a beautiful team. They worked good. But Pete Gillen's mules were a real good team. And they were very visible because they farmed the land there across from Hope Beard's farm, or Hope Beard's store, which is right down here at the corner of Knob Creek Road and Boones Creek Road. And there was always a big cornfield down there, and you'd see Buck and Eddie out plowing with those mules. And we're standing there looking one day, and Virgil came up. Now, Virgil, he was saying, boy, that's a good set of mules. I wish I had me a mule. And the Gillens would take these mules out, and they'd plow people's gardens and make good money out of it. And they'd plow people's tobacco acreage and make good money out of it. And Virgil's saying, boy, I wish I had me a mule. Virgil's about our age. He said, if I had me a mule, I could go out and I could plow people's gardens. I could plow people's tobacco. I'd make all kinds of money. And yeah, I'd like to have a mule. I wish those two mules there would breed and have a mule, and I could buy it. Well, mules don't breed. and everybody said, duh, And Hope said, well, mules don't breed. And Virgil said, well, how do you get a mule? And Hope had just been to the store. He'd been into town, and he had a coconut. back in there. He went out and brought this coconut out, and he said, "Here's a mule egg." Oh, look, picture a coconut and a farm kid, right? He had never seen a coconut before. This is a mule egg. Now, what you need to do, Virgil, you take this thing and you take it back to your barn, and don't let your parents know you got it. You can surprise them with this mule. But you just make you kind of a nest there in the barn like you would for a hen, and you put that mule in it, and you need to sit on it and keep it warm all you can. And then at night, when you come in, just put a blanket over it and just keep it real warm, and then but sit on it every chance you get, and don't let anybody know about it, and then you'll have your little mule, and you can raise that mule up, and you can play with it, name it, and then you can plow and make all that money with it, Oh, wow. He put that mule in his pocket, and he went back home, and Rick and Spider, they went by there all the time. They'd see Virgil sitting in the barn on that mule egg. And Virgil, he's a patient kind. He got some hope. How long is it going to take to hatch that mule egg? He'd been sitting on it for about 10 days, Hope said, "Well, give it a little more time. Just give it a little more time." And we were all there one day, and Virgil said, I've sat on this thing, said, "I don't think it's ever going to hatch. I think it's a defective mule egg." And he finally got mad, and he picked that coconut up, that mule egg, and he threw it out behind the hen house and into a little briar patch back there, and darn if a big rabbit didn't jump out. And it looked just like a mule had hatched and was running out. And we said, "Virgil, aren't you going to catch that thing? That's your little mule running up there." He said, "Man, I don't think there's any use. Even if I caught it, it runs so fast I couldn't plow behind it." Go for it.
Oh, my goodness. I think I'm going to tell you a story about something that will come up here pretty quick in the fall, a lot quicker than we expected to. We knew. When there was a chill in the air, we knew. We knew it was time for our favorite holiday. I mean, I know that sounds strange, but we loved Halloween. And we grew up in such a different time. It was not a time where people thought that if you dressed up on Halloween, you were going to turn into some mass murderer later in life. No, it was a time when you put on a princess costume and you became a princess, or you put on a superhero costume and you became Superman. That's what it was. And it was a time when we got lots and lots of candy. I mean, we had store-bought candy, sure, but this was massive amounts of store-bought candy. Mom gave us each a shopping bag, and we would fill them full. And all four of us girls, after that night, would go up and we would dump out our shopping bag full of candy on our white chenille bedspreads. And we would choose which piece we liked best, and we would trade. And we tried to keep our candy lasting as long as we could get it to last. Teresa, my oldest sister, did everything correctly. And she was the good girl of the four of us. And so she would make hers last till Easter because she would never eat more than 2 pieces at a time. Beth, my youngest, the most feisty, she was usually finished by the weekend with hers. But we loved that time. And we loved it for another reason. Boones Creek Christian Church had always the best Halloween parties for teenagers. Now, I know that probably goes against your grain right now, but that's the way it was back then. And we would have usually a haunted house. And we were kind of tired of the haunted houses they had done. I mean, there's only so many times that you can convince teenagers that the decorated fellowship hall was a haunted house, and that a bowl of grapes were someone's eyeballs, and spaghetti was somebody's brains. I mean, you can only do that so many times with the same group of teenagers and get them to really believe it. So when they said they were going to do a haunted house, we were like, oh, great, another haunted house at the fellowship hall. But this year, they had something else in mind. See, the home builders class had been asked, along with the joy class, to do a real haunted house this year. And so as they got together and they were talking about it, David Saylor stood up in home builders class and he said, well, I got myself an idea. He said, I've been thinking about this haunted house we're going to do. And he said, and he'd scratch his bald head. He said, I think that we can use Granny's house. It's still standing on the farm, and as long as we don't get a big wind between now and then, I think it'll hold up for us. Mary Lois Saylor, his cousin, chimed right in and said, that's a great idea, David. Too bad Granny ain't here, because my goodness, she could look a hole right through you. She was so mean looking sometimes, but I guess she's not going to be here anymore. Well, anyway, they got the house together. Late nights, whispers down the hall at church made us even more excited, even more scared. We asked everyone we knew at our high school to come. It was a huge party, a huge event, and everybody wanted to get invited to the Boones Creek Christian Church haunted house. Well, I got home from school that day when the day finally came. And when I pulled in, I knew my daddy had done his job, because there sat 2 wagons hooked up to John Deere tractors with hay about this thick on all of them and hay bales scattered around. He was to take the youth on the hay ride. All the youth were coming to our house. I thought it looked so cozy and romantic. I had such hopes of my romantic night with my high school sweetheart, Mickey Rogers. So I went inside and I put on his football jersey, because see, Daniel Boone was 4-0 so far that year, and he was one of the stars, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew he was mine, and I was with him that night. So I proudly wore 83 on my chest in the red football jersey, hip hugger blue jeans that went out into bell bottoms over red Converse tennis shoes. I thought I looked great. I came downstairs and stood in front of Mother, and I could tell by the way she looked at me. She didn't like what I was wearing. I said, what's wrong? She said, that football jersey has a ton of holes in it. It's going to be really cold tonight. You are going to freeze to death. I said, Mom, Mickey will keep me warm. And from the look on her face, she could have burnt toast with those eyes. She said, you go get yourself a coat right now. And I went down the hall and got my cheerleading letter jacket on and went out and waited for all the kids to get there. And when we got there that night, Ginger, my friend from church, Ginger Cox, she didn't have a date, so I said, Ginger, you can sit with Mickey and I. And she climbed up on the bale of hay with us, and we were all under a blanket. And my mom had already warned me my father had rear view mirrors on that tractor, and he'd be watching me. But anyway, we were on there, and it took probably about an hour to get to David Saylor's farm. Now, David Saylor's farm probably wasn't more than 4 or 5 miles from the house. But when you have 2 trailer loads, tractor trailers with wagons pulling about 100 kids, it takes you a while to get there. My dad was not going to go fast at all. So it was wonderful having all that time with my sweetheart on the wagon. But anyway, we get there, and when we pull in, there's a big bonfire going, and I can tell that they've got food set up on tables. And there's a woman there with a black hat and an old face and a wart on her nose. Come, she said. We want you to eat. We love our children and fat. Ginger looked at me and she said, who is that? And I said, Ginger, it's our church haunted house. It's somebody from church. It's no problem. Well, Mike Hamilton. You know Mike Hamilton? Anybody? Mike and Pat Hamilton. The Hamilton boys grew up in Boones Creek. Mike was such a teaser. He said, well, I wouldn't be too sure about that if I were you. I've read stories where witches watch and see when churches are having Halloween parties, and then they go and they steal the innocent girls. He said. Ginger said, Becky, is he telling the truth? I said, it's Mike Hamilton. He's not telling the truth, Ginger. Well, anyway, we all ate our hot dogs and our chips and drinks. And about that time, an old man came out of the woods that was right beside where we were. And he pointed at us, and he just went like this. We were teenagers. We followed him, for goodness sake. Into the woods, this man with this long beard. Well, anyway, we get into the woods. They jump out at us. You know, they've got werewolf mask on. They've got devil mask on. You cannot imagine how frightening it was. We're screaming. They're grabbing us. We're running as hard as we can. And we get to the house, and there's a line. And when you are afraid, the last thing you need is to be at the back of the line, for goodness sakes. But that's where Ginger and Mickey and I were. And we were at the back waiting, and people were screaming. We could hear them in the haunted house, blood-curdling screams. Finally, we watched as one boy ran out the door, jumped over our heads, and kept running. He never came back to our church again. But we were scared out of our minds. And the old woman on the porch said, come in. Most who come never want to leave. We were scared to death. My legs were shaking before I ever got to the front door. When we went into the front door, we immediately went into what must have been the living room or the parlor. And there in front of the window was a long casket. It was open. We held hands and walked over to the casket. I looked down, and there was someone that looked like they had been chopped all to pieces in it. I looked over at Ginger about the time that body came up out of the casket and grabbed my leather jacket. I screamed bloody murder, about knocked Ginger down. Ginger was all over Mickey at this point. We went running into the next room, which was the dining room, and a woman was standing there, and she said, I hope that our meal is not one bit boring. And she lifted off this huge chafing dish, and there was a live boar's head. I mean, a real boar's head. It wasn't live anymore because it had been cut off at the neck. But it was a boar, I mean, with tusk, and it was the grossest thing I'd ever seen and the scariest thing I'd ever seen. And we took off running, screaming as fast and as loud as we could, and we started up the steps where people's hands went through holes and grabbed our legs as we made it up the steps. And that's when we saw him, Frankenstein. He stood there with his blocked head, and it scared the pee out of me. And in the corner of that room, you know, I left a puddle because once you start in a stream like that, you cannot stop it no matter what. Thank goodness nobody noticed because Frankenstein went after Ginger. Now, Ginger had made herself a pocketbook. It wasn't an ordinary pocketbook. It was a very different pocketbook. It was made with an empty Clorox bottle where she'd cut off the top and crocheted around the top of the Clorox bottle. And she had one of those Melmac hairbrushes inside it. Ginger, when Frankenstein came at her, began to swing that like Goliath, David did with that little stone that killed Goliath. And she swung that, and she hit Frankenstein over the head several times. She jumped over him as he laid in the floor, groaning, as we ran back out of the house and went and got back on the wagon. Nobody ever knew I peed in my pants. I was so glad of that. We don't have haunted houses at Boones Creek Christian Church anymore. You see, the man that was in that Frankenstein costume had to have $2,000 worth of dental work done the next day. And even though we don't have haunted houses and we don't dress up in Halloween costumes anymore because we're too old, if you back me into a corner and you scare me to death, I'm still going to pee in the floor.
One of the first stories I ever told was I love this old country preacher by the name of Wendy Bagwell. And some of you are my age probably remember Wendy Bagwell. He would travel around with this group, singing group. It's called Wendy Bagwell and the Sunlighters. He was an evangelist, but he started telling stories about things that had happened at the church that he just left. So he became known as a storyteller. It was the Ebenezer Free Will Baptist Church, all day singing and dinner on the ground homecoming revival. And the church was full. I mean, you couldn't put another person in that church. They had to bring the folding chairs and put them down the outside aisles of the church. The only place that was vacant in that church was the center aisle that ran from the pulpit out the front door of the church. And the reason that there were so many people here on this particular Sunday was because that there was this famous singing group that was there. It was a blind family. They would just sing those beautiful, heartfelt melodies and harmonies. Everyone in the church would be caught up in it when they started singing. Well, when the person that was in charge of the blind folks brought them up to the pulpit, he didn't have any place to put those 3 big German police CNI dogs. So he laid them down right there in front of the pulpit with their heads pointed out the center aisle of that church, pointed out toward the front door of the church. And the preacher was concerned about having those 3 big animals there. So the preacher went over to the person in charge of the blind folks and he said, "Will them dogs be all right?" And the person in charge of the blind folks, he said, "Will them dogs be all right? Them dogs are highly trained. I told them dogs to stay, and they don't forget." Now, preacher, when you get up and you start your sermon today, half the people in here, they'll forget what you said. They'll walk right out that door and forget. But them dogs don't forget. Them dogs are highly trained. Don't you worry about them dogs. He said, "Okay, I won't worry about them dogs." Well, the blind family got up and they started singing those heartfelt melodies and harmonies. Everyone in the church was caught up in the service. Didn't nobody even notice when that old yeller cat come a-walking in the front door of that church. Didn't nobody even notice that old yeller cat, excepting for them 3 big German police CNI dogs. You know what they done? They forgot. Now, you'd have thought that old yeller cat would have turned around, shot right out the front door of that church, but it didn't. It shot under the benches over on this side. And you'd have thought there wasn't room for them 3 big German police CNI dogs under them benches, but they was. Pandemonium broke out on this side of the church. I mean, you could tell what was going on this side of the church by the way they were exploding up out of their seats. I mean, they were flat-footing from a sitting position, and that ain't easy. It was one of them, "Look out, Sadie, there ain't no door, there is now" types of situations. Well, the people over on this side of the church, They didn't have no idea what was going on this side of the church. People on this side of the church thought an old-fashioned shouting revival had done broke out. They started shouting about as loud as the people over on this side of the church. Only difference was the people on this side of the church was shouting, "Glory, hallelujah." People on this side of the church was shouting, "Lord, help me, Jesus." And all the while, that cat was a-scratching and a-clawing for its life. Somebody said, "I bet there's some runs in some pantyhose." Let me tell you, there's some of them running out of their pantyhose. They was trying to go forward. They was trying to go back. There was room in that choir loft for 20 people. Had 40 people in it and 40 people on the way. All the while, that blind family, they was up there just singing their hearts out. They didn't have no idea what was going on. Only thing they was thinking was they'd done took that job too cheap. But if you ever went to pick up the service in your church, get yourself an old yellow cat. 3 German police CNI dogs. You may not get a whole lot of new members, but you'll sure scare the devil out of the ones you've got.
Leon's going to tell us a couple more poems here, and I'm going to close with a straight scripture telling. I started out by telling you tonight that we do different things, and he knows I love everything he does as much as he loves everything I do. But the thing that we love the most that we have in common is we love Jesus. And so we're going to end with a little scripture telling about our Savior.
You know, I didn't start telling stories till later in life. I've been telling stories for 20 years now. I was a founding member of the Jonesboro Storytellers Guild. We have our president of the Jonesboro Storytellers Guild here with us.
Yeah, we have a lot of our guild here.
If anybody wants to tell stories, come on a Tuesday night to the International Storytelling Center at 7 o'clock. Just hang out with us. We can make you a member. We can make you a storyteller. We've got several people here from the Jonesboro Storytellers Guild. But if you want to pursue that, it's never too late to start. It really isn't. It's never
I'm going
too
to tell them how I got started. Leon had been telling for, I guess, 10 years before I started telling, and then I ended up doing my master's in storytelling at East Tennessee State University, and one of our professors of that program is here tonight, and when I finished my master's, Leon kept saying, "You got to join the guild, you got to join the guild." And I had a 1-year-old and it's about 2-year-old and a newborn. And I said, "Oh, I don't have time. But Leon organized a sacred storytelling here at the church, inspirational storytelling here at our church. And he asked me to tell in it, and I did. And then they said, after it's over with, they said, "Well, that was your audition. You're a member." So, and I've been telling with them ever since. That was in 1997. So.
Yeah, we have a mentoring program that really trains storytellers. So if you're interested, come on. And then the Jonesboro Yarn Exchange does an old-time radio show. We record live at the International Storytelling Center the 4th Monday of the month at 7 o'clock. It's a live recording. We have some fantastic musicians that join us. And then it's broadcast on the 4th Wednesday night at 8 o'clock on NPR. And it's a good radio show. It really is.
It's excellent.
It's all local people telling local stories. George Holly, I'm going to tell a story that happened before you was born. You know, you learn a lot of history just by what people tell you, stories and I learned this story from my granddad. It started out in this church 88 years ago. It was 1926. Now, my grandmother, my grandfather was Brian Kiefhofer, and his brother Dewey Kiefhofer lived in the house then, or owned the house that I live in today. You know, really, if you leave this driveway and you go down here to the Boones Creek Road and you head toward Jonesboro, 2 miles down there to the red light, turn right on Highland Church Road and go up to my house, second house on the right. It's 2.5 miles from here to there, and everything on the right side of the road is exactly the way it was when I was a kid. It's very nostalgic for me, and I think that's why I keep anchored into these hills here, because I see it so much. And I make every Sunday morning I go out early, and I'm a jogger, so I run out here and around the church and back, and I just go back to those days. I can remember all the things we did. I remember right before Easter in 1961, Ernest Carter had my brother and I cleaned the barn out down here, and we cleaned the barn out right here behind the church. I don't see many expressions, but you remember what it smelled like to clean a cow barn out, put it in a manure spreader and spread it out? And we did it the Saturday before the Easter service. Wasn't real popular for a while. But I always think about that, as I'm jogging down the road and some of the things we did, all the hay we put up. But in 1926, my Uncle Paul Kefauver got married. Paul was the younger of my grandfather's siblings, married Beulah. And they were married in this church, and they spent their honeymoon night in the house where I live now. They hadn't found a place to live yet, and the house was unoccupied, so they spent their wedding night in the house where we live. Now, the Boones Creek Historic Trust has this cookbook that they like to sell, and it has pictures of the old houses around here and some stories and some recipes, and the story that's in it is one that I picked up from my grandfather. It was 1926, and the weather was hot when Beulah and Paul decided they'd tie the knot. They'd be bonded together in holy matrimony at the Boones Creek Church in a very nice wedding ceremony. The women in the families helped plan the wedding real nice, with cakes for the bride and groom and then showering them with rice. The men had other thoughts, like spiking the lemonade and entertaining through the evening with a country serenade. Now, a serenade is usually the performing at night of a vocal or an instrumental to a sweetheart's delight, but a country serenade takes on a whole new meaning. It keeps the newlyweds up all night with loud noises and screaming. Beulah was a beautiful, blushing bride, and Paul made it to the altar without being hogtied. They repeated the vows, the knot was tied. Throughout the service, the women folk cried. The wedding was beautiful, the decor was elegant, but the men in the service said, "This night ain't even begun yet." They kept their provisions out of sight. They didn't want anyone to see their guns or their dynamite. They repeated the vows, and into the night they rode to their honeymoon house out near Kibler's Crossroad. That's where Paul carried Beulah across the threshold, and things began to happen as the night started to turn cold. The men began caterwauling like cats at mating time. The sounds of jungle animals would make chills run up your spine. First, they emptied their shotguns, then their muskets and navy colts. Sounded like thunder. Their muzzles flashed like lightning bolts. Paul tried to run them off. He yelled with all his might. Then their brothers brought out their stick of dynamite. For a few moments, they were quiet, as silent as they could be, as they were tying that dynamite up in a nearby apple tree. Paul and Beulah thought that the serenade had ended, and as Paul was kissing his spouse, the last noise the serenaders were sending blew the bedroom windows out of their house. Paul and Beulah knew that their love would last. They knew that their feelings toward each other were true. But if kissing would cause this kind of a blast, they was glad they didn't do what they started to do. I think it was 70 years later Paul and Beulah had their 70th wedding anniversary up here at the church. And I told that poem. And Beulah said she was going to whip me, but she never did. Let's bring it home, Rebecca.
Okay. A lot of what I love to do is straight scripture telling, so I'm going to tell a piece from the book of Mark for you tonight. Jesus left there and entered the vicinity of Tyre. And he entered a house there. But he did not want anyone to know it. But he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet. She was a Greek, born in Cyrene, Phoenicia. And she begged Jesus to take the demon from her daughter. And Jesus said, "It is not right to take the bread of children and toss it to the dogs? She said, yes, Lord. But even the children under the table get the dogs' crumbs. And he said, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home, and she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre, and he went down through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the Decapolis. And some people brought to him a man who could not hear and could barely speak. And they asked Jesus just to touch him. And Jesus took the man by the hand and he led him away from the crowd. And he spit and he touched the man's tongue. And he put his hands in the man's ears. And he lifted his eyes toward heaven and he said, Ephata, which means be opened. And at once, the man's tongue was loosened and his ears were open and he could speak plainly. And Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone what they had seen. But the more he did that, the more they could not stop talking about him. They were overwhelmed with amazement. They said, he does all things well. He can make the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. About that time, another large crowd had gathered around Jesus. And he knew that they had not eaten. So he called his disciples to him and he said, these people have been with me for 3 days, some of them, and have not eaten anything. If I send them home hungry, some will perish along the way. The disciples looked to each other and they said, where in this remote region could we get enough bread to feed them all? And Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And so he took those 7 loaves and he asked the crowd to sit down. And when he took the bread, he broke it and he blessed it. And he gave it to the disciples for them to distribute. And then they had a few fish and he blessed it and broke it as well. And the disciples passed out the food among the people, and everyone ate until they were satisfied. And then the disciples went around and they picked up 7 basketfuls of leftover pieces. There were 4,000 men there that day. Jesus got into the boat and he, with his disciples, after he had sent the people on the way, and they headed for Dalmanutha. When they arrived there, the Pharisees were waiting on them. And they said to him as a test, give us a sign from heaven. And he said, what is it about this generation that you always want a miraculous sign? I tell you right now, not one will be given it. And he and the disciples got in the boat and left for the other side. And on the way there, he said, watch out. Be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. The disciples had only brought 1 loaf of bread, so they began to whisper to themselves, it is because we have no bread. He said, why is it that you talk about having no bread? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes to see but fail to see, and ears to hear but fail to hear? When I fed the 5 loaves to the 5,000, how many basketfuls of leftover pieces did you pick up? He said, 12.
And when I fed the 7 loaves to the 4,000, how many basketfuls of leftover pieces did you pick up then? He said, 7. And you still do not understand? Jesus went on to Bethsaida, and when he arrived there, they brought to him, a crowd did, they brought to him a man who was blind. And Jesus took the man by the hand and he led him away from the village. And he spit and touched the man's eyes. And he said, "What do you see?" The man said, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. And so he reached up and he put his hands on the man's eyes again. And he said, "Now what do you see?" And he said, I can see everything clearly. And he said, "Do not go back into the village. Go home." Jesus and his disciples went on, walking to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way there, he said to the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" John the Baptist? Some say you're Elijah. Still others say one of the prophets. He said, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter said, "You are the Christ." Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we are just thank you. We thank you. Leon and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts that we grew up in a community like Boones Creek. That we grew up with parents that loved you and knew you and taught us about you. That we had so many people that touched our lives in so many ways that we can't stop telling stories about them. We thank you for this group, for the ability to be here with them tonight, and for the friends and family that always come and support us. May your work be done on this earth, and may we be your instruments. In thy precious and holy name we pray. Amen. Leon and I want to thank you. We've had a great time. It's been fun to be with you.